At the bustling O'Hare International Airport in Chicago, Marcus Johnson stood quietly near Gate 32, blending into the crowd of travelers. He was an ordinary-looking man, average height, wearing a simple navy blue jacket and jeans, with a backpack slung over one shoulder. But what set him apart from the rest wasn't visible to anyone around him. Beneath his calm exterior, Marcus carried a purpose that went far beyond catching a flight to Los Angeles. He wasn't just another passenger, he was a federal auditor, working undercover for the Department of Transportation. His mission? To uncover whether airlines were treating passengers fairly or if hidden biases were influencing their decisions. The day had started like any other. Marcus arrived at the airport early, giving himself plenty of time to observe the chaos that unfolded before every departure. People rushed back and forth, dragging suitcases, checking phones, and glancing anxiously at the digital screens displaying flight statuses. Some looked stressed, others excited, but everyone shared one goal: getting on their plane and reaching their destination. Marcus watched it all with sharp eyes, taking mental notes about how people interacted with the airline staff. He noticed how some passengers seemed to get preferential treatment, a warm smile here, a quick response there, while others were brushed off or ignored altogether. Marcus's ticket was for economy class, though he could have easily afforded first class if he wanted to. That wasn't the point. For this assignment, he needed to experience exactly what regular passengers went through. He stepped up to the counter when his turn came, handing over his boarding pass and ID without saying much. The agent barely glanced at him, nodding curtly, as she scanned his documents. "Have a safe flight," she said automatically, her tone polite but distant. Marcus nodded back, not expecting anything more. He knew better than to assume kindness would come easily, especially in places where efficiency mattered more than connection. As he moved toward the gate area, Marcus found a seat near the window, close enough to watch the planes taxiing on the runway. He opened his backpack and pulled out a small notebook, jotting down observations about the scene around him. There was a young family nearby trying to keep their toddler entertained, a businessman typing furiously on his laptop, and a group of college students laughing loudly as they scrolled through social media on their phones. Each person told a story, and Marcus made it his job to listen, not with his ears, but with his instincts. Over the years, he'd learned to pick up on subtle cues, the kind most people overlooked. It was these details that often revealed the truth behind how systems worked, or failed. The announcement came over the intercom shortly after. "Attention passengers. We have a limited number of complimentary upgrades available for first-class seating. If you're interested, please raise your hand or approach the desk." Marcus sat up straighter, his pen pausing mid-sentence. This was the moment he'd been waiting for. Upgrades were rare, and they usually depended on factors like frequent flyer status, loyalty programs, or even just plain luck. But sometimes something else played a role, something less official and harder to prove. Bias. He raised his hand along with several other passengers, including a white couple seated a few rows ahead of him. They exchanged curious glances with each other, clearly hoping for good news. Marcus kept his expression neutral, pretending to be just another hopeful traveler. The gate agent walked down the aisle, clipboard in hand, scanning the raised hands. She stopped briefly at the white couple, smiling warmly as she gestured for them to follow her to the desk. Then she continued walking, completely bypassing Marcus. Not a word, not a glance, nothing. It was almost as if he didn't exist. Marcus felt a flicker of frustration, but quickly pushed it aside. He'd expected this might happen, though it still stung. Instead of dwelling on it, he focused on documenting everything. He noted the time, the agent's name badge, and the exact sequence of events. Later, he would compare this incident to others he'd witnessed during previous flights. Patterns always emerged when you paid attention, and Marcus was nothing if not attentive. For now, he leaned back in his chair, watching as the couple returned triumphantly with new boarding passes in hand. They chatted happily, oblivious to the fact that someone nearby had been overlooked entirely. When boarding began, Marcus joined the line for economy class, keeping his head down as he shuffled forward. The flight attendants greeted passengers with practiced smiles, but their energy shifted noticeably depending on who approached. First-class passengers received enthusiastic welcomes, complete with offers to help carry bags and directions to their plush seats. Economy passengers, on the other hand, were met with brisk nods and vague gestures toward the rear of the plane. Marcus filed onto the aircraft silently, finding his assigned seat by the window. As he settled in, he couldn't help but notice how different the atmosphere felt between the two sections. In first class, laughter bubbled freely, champagne glasses clinked, and conversations flowed effortlessly. Back in economy, the mood was quieter, almost resigned. Despite the disparity, Marcus stayed focused. He pulled out his notebook again, jotting down fresh observations about the boarding process. He also activated the tiny camera embedded in his glasses, ensuring he captured clear footage of the cabin crew's interactions. Everything he recorded would later serve as evidence, helping paint a picture of how this particular airline operated. Though he couldn't confront the staff directly, that would blow his cover. He took comfort in knowing that his work would eventually lead to accountability. Justice, he believed, didn't always come immediately, but it came steadily, piece by piece. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Marcus closed his eyes briefly, letting the hum of the engines wash over him. Flying undercover wasn't easy. It required patience, discipline, and a willingness to face uncomfortable truths. Yet for Marcus, it was worth it. Every denied upgrade, every dismissive glance, and every unequal exchange reminded him why he did what he did. Fairness shouldn't be a privilege reserved for a select few. It should be a guarantee for everyone. And until that became reality, Marcus Johnson would continue doing his part, one flight at a time. The plane climbed higher into the sky, leaving behind the sprawling cityscape of Chicago. Marcus adjusted his seatbelt and glanced out the window, watching as the clouds formed a soft white blanket below. Though he appeared relaxed, his mind was anything but. He replayed the events at the gate over and over again, how the agent had ignored him despite his raised hand, how she had smiled warmly at the white couple instead. It wasn't just about being denied an upgrade. It was about what that denial represented. To Marcus, it was another piece of a much larger puzzle, one he'd been piecing together for years. He turned his attention to the cabin crew now bustling up and down the aisles. They moved with practiced efficiency, distributing blankets and headphones to first-class passengers while barely acknowledging those in economy. Marcus noticed how their tone changed depending on whom they spoke to. In first class, their voices were cheerful and upbeat, often accompanied by personal touches like, "Enjoy your flight, Mr. Anderson," or, "Let us know if you need anything, Ms. Carter." In economy, however, their words were clipped and impersonal, blanket or headphones, with no effort to make conversation. Marcus jotted this down in his notebook, adding it to the growing list of observations. To pass the time, Marcus struck up casual conversations with the people seated around him. The woman next to him, an older lady named Ruth, seemed friendly. Enough. She introduced herself between sips of her soda and mentioned she had been flying for decades. When Marcus casually brought up the topic of upgrades, Ruth's expression shifted slightly. "Oh, I've seen that happen before," she said, lowering her voice. "It's not always fair, is it? I remember once seeing a black man, actually, get passed over for an upgrade even though he'd been waiting longer than anyone else. It happens more than you'd think." Marcus nodded thoughtfully, encouraging her to continue without revealing his true identity. Ruth went on to share stories from her travels, pointing out moments when she believed race or appearance had influenced how someone was treated. Her insights weren't surprising to Marcus, but they reinforced what he already suspected. Bias in the airline industry wasn't isolated, it was systemic. Every story Ruth shared added weight to his investigation, giving him a clearer picture of the challenges passengers faced daily. As the flight progressed, Marcus decided to test the crew's attentiveness himself. He pressed the call button above his seat and waited. Minutes ticked by, but no one came. He pressed it again, this time holding it down a little longer. Still, nothing. Meanwhile, he observed how quickly the flight attendants responded to requests from first-class passengers. A man in a tailored suit rang his call button, and within seconds, a flight attendant appeared with a bright smile, ready to assist. Marcus made a note of the timing. Nearly 10 minutes for his request versus less than 30 seconds for the man in first class. Frustrated but determined, Marcus decided to stretch his legs under the pretense of needing to use the restroom. As he walked toward the back of the plane, he kept his eyes open, observing how the crew interacted with other passengers. Near the galley, he overheard two flight attendants chatting quietly. One of them joked about a passenger in economy who had asked for extra snacks, referring to him dismissively as that guy. Marcus didn't catch the full context, but the tone alone spoke volumes. These small, seemingly harmless comments reflected deeper attitudes that could shape how passengers were treated. Returning to his seat, Marcus pulled out his notebook once more. He wrote down everything he'd seen and heard, careful to include specific details. Timestamps, names, when visible, and exact quotes, all of it mattered. He also reviewed the footage captured by his hidden camera, ensuring it was clear and usable. Each piece of evidence strengthened his case, providing undeniable proof of the disparities he aimed to expose. Though the process was tedious, Marcus found satisfaction in knowing that his work would eventually lead to change. By now, the initial excitement of takeoff had faded, and the cabin had settled into a steady rhythm. Passengers flipped through magazines, watched movies on their screens, or dozed off against the windows. Marcus, however, remained alert. He knew better than to let his guard down, even for a moment. His job required constant awareness, a skill he'd honed over years of working undercover. He thought back to previous assignments, recalling the countless flights he'd taken under different aliases. Each trip had taught him something new, whether it was recognizing patterns of discrimination or learning how to blend in seamlessly with crowds. Despite the challenges, Marcus never lost sight of why he did what he did. Growing up, he'd witnessed firsthand how unfair systems could marginalize people based on race, income, or background. Those experiences had shaped him, fueling his determination to fight for equality wherever he found injustice. Now, as an auditor, he had the tools and authority to make a difference, not through loud protests or dramatic gestures, but through meticulous documentation and unyielding persistence. Quietly, steadily, he chipped away at the barriers that stood in the way of fairness. As the plane cruised smoothly through the air, Marcus allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. He thought about the passengers around him, the mother trying to soothe her crying baby, the college student scrolling through playlists, the businessman typing furiously on his laptop. Each of them had their own stories, their own struggles. And while Marcus couldn't solve all their problems, he could at least ensure that their experiences with the airline industry were fair. That was his mission, his purpose. For now, he would stay patient, gathering evidence and staying focused. The real work would come later, when he returned to the office and began compiling his report. Still, Marcus couldn't help but feel a spark of anticipation. He knew that what he uncovered on this flight would be significant. Patterns always emerged when you paid close attention, and Marcus had spent years perfecting the art of observation. By the end of the journey, he would have enough material to build a compelling case, one that could hold the airline accountable and push for meaningful change. Until then, he would remain watchful, taking notes, recording footage, and listening carefully to the world around him. Because fairness shouldn't be a privilege reserved for a select few. It should be a guarantee for everyone, and Marcus Johnson was determined to make sure it became reality. The flight was now well into its second hour, and the cabin had settled into a quiet rhythm. Most passengers were either asleep or engrossed in their personal screens, while the hum of conversation had dwindled to a soft murmur. Marcus, however, remained wide awake and alert. He leaned back slightly in his seat, pretending to relax, but his mind was working tirelessly. Every detail mattered, every interaction, every glance, every word spoken by the crew. He knew that even the smallest observation could make a difference when it came time to present his findings. As he sat there, Marcus noticed something peculiar happening near the front of the plane. A young mother traveling with her toddler had been seated in economy, just a few rows ahead of him. The child was restless, squirming in his seat and occasionally letting out small whimpers. The mother tried her best to calm him down, offering toys and snacks, but the boy's energy seemed endless. Marcus watched as one of the flight attendants approached her. Instead of offering help or reassurance, the attendant gave the woman a tight smile and asked if she could keep it down for the sake of the other passengers. Her tone wasn't harsh, but it carried an edge that made the request feel less like a suggestion and more like a reprimand. Marcus frowned slightly, jotting down the exchange in his notebook. He had seen this kind of thing before, how certain passengers were treated differently based on subtle cues like appearance, behavior, or even the section of the plane they were seated in. First-class travelers rarely faced such scrutiny. If a child in first class became fussy, the crew usually responded with patience and understanding, often bringing extra treats or distractions to smooth things over. But here, in economy, the same situation was met with thinly veiled annoyance. To Marcus, it was another example of how deeply ingrained biases influenced everyday interactions. Later, when the meal service began, Marcus observed yet another disparity. In first class, the crew rolled out a cart filled with gourmet meals, presenting each dish with care and describing the options in detail. Passengers were given choices, chicken or fish, red wine or white, and the entire process felt almost ceremonial. In economy, however, the experience was starkly different. The food trays were handed out quickly without much explanation. When Marcus received his meal, he noticed the portions were smaller, and the quality looked far inferior to what was being served up front. He glanced at Ruth, who had finished eating her sandwich and was now sipping a cup of coffee. "It's always like this," she said quietly, shaking her head. "You pay for the ticket, but you don't really get treated equally." Marcus nodded, adding her comment to his notes. He also took a moment to document the differences in presentation between the two sections. It wasn't just about the food itself. It was about the attitude behind the service. In first class, the crew seemed genuinely invested in making sure passengers were comfortable and satisfied. In economy, the focus was purely functional, as though the staff viewed their role as simply getting through the task as quickly as possible. This divide wasn't accidental. It was intentional, designed to reinforce the idea that some passengers deserved better treatment than others. After finishing his meal, Marcus decided to test the crew once more. He pressed the call button above his seat and waited, timing how long it took for someone to respond. Nearly 8 minutes passed before a flight attendant finally arrived. By then, Marcus had already turned off the light above his seat, signaling that he no longer needed assistance. When the attendant finally approached, she looked surprised to see him sitting quietly. "Did you need something?" she asked, her tone polite but hurried. Marcus shook his head. "No, I'm fine," he replied calmly. He made sure to note the delay in his report, along with the fact that the attendant hadn't apologized for keeping him waiting. Feeling restless, Marcus decided to take another walk around the cabin. As he moved toward the rear of the plane, he noticed how cramped and dimly lit the economy section felt compared to the spaciousness of first class. The seats were narrower, the aisles tighter, and the overhead bins nearly overflowing with carry-on bags. It struck him how these physical differences contributed to the overall atmosphere. First class was designed to feel luxurious and exclusive, while economy was meant to be utilitarian and forgettable. Even the lighting played a role, bright and inviting in the front, muted and uninviting in the back. While standing near the galley, Marcus overheard another conversation between two flight attendants. One of them mentioned a passenger who had complained about the lack of legroom in economy. "Honestly, why do people even bother complaining?" the attendant said with a laugh. "They got what they paid for." Her colleague chuckled in agreement, and they moved on to discuss something else. Marcus clenched his jaw slightly but kept his expression neutral. Comments like these weren't uncommon, but they highlighted the dismissive attitudes some crew members held toward economy passengers. To them, it seemed, those in the cheaper seats didn't deserve the same level of respect or consideration. Returning to his seat, Marcus pulled out his notebook again. He wrote down everything he'd seen and heard, ensuring he captured not only the facts but also the emotions behind each interaction. He believed that understanding the human side of these experiences was just as important as documenting the technical details. After all, policies and procedures were created by people, and changing them required addressing the underlying beliefs that shaped them. For Marcus, this wasn't just about holding the airline accountable. It was about challenging the mindset that allowed such inequalities to persist. As the hours passed, Marcus found himself reflecting on the bigger picture. His work wasn't glamorous or easy, but it was necessary. He thought about the countless passengers who might never realize they were being treated unfairly because they didn't know what happened behind the scenes. He thought about the families, students and workers who saved up for months to afford a ticket, only to be met with indifference or disdain. And he thought about the power of his position, not just as an auditor but as someone who could shine a light on hidden injustices. By the time the captain announced that the plane would begin its descent into Los Angeles, Marcus had filled several pages of his notebook. He reviewed his notes carefully, double-checking timestamps and descriptions to ensure accuracy. Then he switched off his hidden camera, confident that he had captured enough footage to support his findings. Though the flight was ending, his mission was far from over. Once on the ground, he would file a formal complaint using a fake name, testing how seriously the airline took reports of discrimination. Only after gathering all the evidence would he return to his office and compile his final report. As the plane touched down and taxied to the gate, Marcus felt a mix of emotions: frustration at the inequalities he'd witnessed, satisfaction at having documented them so thoroughly, and determination to keep pushing for change. He waited patiently in line to deplane, watching as the same gate agent who had ignored him earlier greeted passengers with a cheerful smile. When it was his turn to exit, Marcus paused for a moment, meeting her gaze. "Good flight," he said simply, his voice calm and steady. The agent blinked, clearly surprised by the unexpected comment, but quickly recovered with a polite nod. Marcus walked away without another word, his backpack slung over one shoulder and his mind already turning to the next steps. For Marcus, this was more than just a job. It was a calling. Every flight, every observation, and every piece of evidence brought him closer to his goal, creating a world where fairness wasn't a privilege reserved for a select few, but a guarantee for everyone. Until that day arrived, he would continue flying under different names, observing different crews, and catching different moments of injustice. Because Marcus Johnson believed that real change came not from loud protests alone, but from quiet, careful work done behind the scenes by people willing to expose the truth. Once off the plane, Marcus moved through the crowded terminal with purpose. The Los Angeles airport buzzed with activity, families reuniting, business travelers rushing to collect their bags, and tourists snapping photos of the iconic palm trees visible through the windows. But Marcus wasn't distracted by any of it. His mind was still on the flight, replaying every detail he had observed and recorded. He knew that the real work was just beginning. While most passengers hurried to baggage claim or headed toward ride-share pickup areas, Marcus found a quiet corner near a coffee shop where he could sit unnoticed. He pulled out his phone and opened a secure app, typing a quick message to his supervisor. Flight completed. Evidence collected. Returning to base for analysis. After sending the message, Marcus took a moment to review everything he had gathered during the trip. His notebook was filled with meticulous notes, each entry time-stamped and written in shorthand that only he would fully understand. He flipped through the pages slowly, ensuring nothing had been missed. There were descriptions of interactions between crew members and passengers, observations about seating upgrades, and even snippets of conversations he'd overheard. Every word mattered. It all added up to paint a clear picture of how bias played out in subtle but significant ways aboard commercial flights. Next, Marcus turned his attention to the footage captured by his hidden camera. Using his phone, he connected to the device embedded in his glasses and began reviewing the clips. The quality was sharp, capturing everything from the dismissive smiles of gate agents to the uneven distribution of meal trays in economy versus first class. One clip showed the young mother struggling to calm her toddler, while a flight attendant hovered nearby, clearly irritated. Another showed the stark contrast in service when the same attendant approached a first-class passenger moments later, offering help with genuine warmth. These visuals weren't just evidence, they told a story, one that couldn't be ignored once presented properly. Satisfied with what he had, Marcus packed away his materials and stood up, slinging his backpack over his shoulder. He walked toward the exit, blending seamlessly into the crowd. To anyone watching, he looked like an ordinary traveler heading home after a long journey. But inside, Marcus felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. He had done exactly what he set out to do: document the inequalities that often went unnoticed by those who weren't looking closely enough. Now it was time to transform these raw observations into something actionable. Back at his office later that evening, Marcus sat at his desk, surrounded by papers, laptops, and folders filled with past reports. The room was small but organized, reflecting the precision with which he approached his work. He powered on his computer and began transferring the video files from his camera to a secure server. This step was crucial. Everything he collected needed to be stored safely, protected from tampering or accidental deletion. Once the transfer was complete, Marcus opened a blank document and started drafting his report. It was a process he had repeated countless times before, yet it never became routine. Each case was unique, requiring careful thought and attention to detail. The report began with a summary of the flight, including the airline, destination, and key incidents. Marcus described the incident at the gate when he was skipped over for a first-class upgrade, providing context about the white couple who were chosen instead. He included timestamps and names wherever possible, ensuring his account was as factual and credible as possible. Next, he outlined the disparities in service he had observed between first class and economy, citing specific examples like the delayed response to his call button and the dismissive treatment of the young mother. He also noted the comments he had overheard from flight attendants, highlighting how language and tone revealed deeper attitudes. As he wrote, Marcus made sure to keep his tone professional and neutral. His goal wasn't to accuse or attack individuals, but to expose systemic issues that affected not just this particular flight but potentially thousands of others like it. He understood that change wouldn't come overnight, but he believed strongly in the power of documentation. By presenting hard facts and irrefutable evidence, he could push decision-makers to take action. Whether it was revising training programs for airline staff or implementing stricter policies around fairness, every step forward mattered. By midnight, Marcus had finished the draft of his report. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples to ease the tension that always built up during late nights like this. Despite the fatigue, he felt a flicker of pride. This wasn't just another assignment. It was a contribution to something larger than himself. He thought about the people whose voices might never be heard without someone like him willing to speak up on their behalf. For Marcus, that was worth every hour spent observing, recording, and writing. Before calling it a night, Marcus sent the draft to his supervisor for review. Attached to the email was a note summarizing his findings and emphasizing the importance of addressing the patterns he had uncovered. "This isn't an isolated incident," he wrote. "It's part of a broader issue that affects countless passengers daily. We have an opportunity to make a difference here." After hitting send, he closed his laptop and stretched, feeling the weight of the day settle over him. Tomorrow he would begin preparing for his next assignment, but for now he allowed himself a moment of rest. The following morning, Marcus arrived at the office early, ready to finalize the report based on feedback from his supervisor. As expected, there were minor edits to address, clarifying certain points, adding more context, or refining language for clarity. Marcus worked through them methodically, knowing that precision was key. Once the revisions were complete, the report was officially submitted to the Department of Transportation. From there, it would be reviewed by officials who decided whether further investigation or action was warranted. While waiting for updates, Marcus reflected on the impact of his work. He knew that audits like this didn't always lead to immediate results. Sometimes airlines push back against accusations of bias, claiming isolated incidents or misinterpretations. Other times, they promised reforms that never materialized. But Marcus had learned to focus on the bigger picture. Even if progress was slow, every report added pressure, making it harder for companies to ignore the problems within their systems. Change came gradually layer by layer, until one day it became undeniable. In the meantime, Marcus prepared for his next undercover assignment. This time, he would be flying from New York to Miami, posing as a college student returning home for the holidays. The details of his cover story were already mapped out. His fake ID, background, and travel history all carefully crafted to ensure authenticity. As he packed his bag, Marcus reminded himself why he did this work. It wasn't for recognition or praise. It was because he believed deeply in fairness. Everyone deserved to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of race, income, or background. And until that belief became a universal reality, Marcus Johnson would continue doing his part, one flight at a time. A few weeks had passed since Marcus submitted his report, and the wait for official action felt like a test of patience. He spent his days preparing for new assignments, reviewing old cases, and analyzing data from other auditors across the country. The Department of Transportation worked slowly, often bogged down by bureaucracy and competing priorities. But Marcus understood that persistence was key. Even if it took months, or sometimes years, for changes to happen, he trusted that his work planted seeds that would eventually grow into meaningful reform. One afternoon, as Marcus sat at his desk, sifting through emails, he received an update about the airline he had investigated during his Chicago to Los Angeles flight. It wasn't the sweeping policy overhaul he had hoped for, but it was progress nonetheless. The airline had issued a public statement acknowledging concerns about potential inconsistencies in passenger treatment and promised to review its training protocols for staff. They also mentioned plans to implement anonymous feedback systems, so passengers could report issues without fear of retaliation. While the language was vague and cautious, Marcus knew this was a step forward. Airlines rarely admitted fault publicly unless they felt pressured to do so. Marcus leaned back in his chair, reading the statement several times. He allowed himself a small smile, though he didn't celebrate too much. Promises were one thing, actions were another. He made a mental note to monitor the airline closely over the coming months, ensuring they followed through on their commitments. If they didn't, he'd be ready to expose them again. For now, however, he chose to see this as a victory, a reminder that even small wins mattered in the fight for fairness. Later that week, Marcus boarded yet another flight, this time heading from New York to Miami. His cover story was solid. A college student named Jamal Thompson returning home for winter break. He wore a hoodie and carried a backpack stuffed with books and snacks, blending perfectly into the crowd of young travelers. At the gate, he struck up conversations with fellow students, laughing about final exams and holiday plans. To anyone watching, he seemed completely ordinary. Only those closest to him would recognize the quiet determination behind his friendly demeanor. As the flight progressed, Marcus noticed familiar patterns emerging. First-class passengers were greeted warmly and offered complimentary drinks within minutes of takeoff. Economy passengers, on the other hand, waited longer for basic amenities like water or blankets. When meal service began, the disparity was glaring. In first class, trays arrived loaded with fresh salads, steaming entrees, and dessert options. In economy, the food looked bland and uninspired, served quickly and without explanation. Marcus documented everything, taking notes discreetly and capturing video footage whenever possible. During the flight, Marcus decided to conduct a small experiment. He pressed his call button and timed how long it took for a flight attendant to respond. 5 minutes passed before someone finally appeared. By contrast, when a first-class passenger rang their button, a crew member arrived almost instantly. Marcus noted the difference in his notebook, adding it to the growing list of observations. He also paid attention to how questions were answered, differently depending on the section of the plane. In first class, responses were polite and detailed. In economy, they were brief and impersonal, as though the staff wanted to move on as quickly as possible. Toward the end of the flight, Marcus struck up a conversation with a middle-aged man seated beside him. The man introduced himself as Greg and mentioned he traveled frequently for work. When Marcus casually brought up the topic of upgrades, Greg sighed and shook his head. "It's always the same," he said. "If you're not flying business class or higher, good luck getting any kind of special treatment. I've been flying for years, and I can count on one hand the number of times I've been upgraded." Marcus nodded sympathetically, encouraging Greg to share more. The man went on to describe instances where he felt ignored or dismissed because of his seating arrangement, reinforcing what Marcus already suspected. Bias wasn't limited to race or appearance. It extended to ticket class as well. Once the plane landed in Miami, Marcus deplaned quietly, keeping his expression neutral as he walked past the gate agents. He knew better than to confront anyone directly. His role was to observe, document, and report. Back at his hotel later that evening, he reviewed his findings, making sure every detail was recorded accurately. He uploaded the video footage to the secure server and drafted a preliminary report summarizing his observations. Though this flight hadn't yielded any major surprises, it added valuable context to the broader investigation he was conducting. The next morning, Marcus attended a meeting with his team at the Department of Transportation office. The room buzzed with energy as auditors shared updates from their recent assignments. One colleague discussed a case involving wheelchair accessibility issues at a major airport, while another highlighted concerns about baggage handling practices that disproportionately affected low-income travelers. When it was Marcus's turn to speak, he presented his findings from both the Chicago-Los Angeles and New York-Miami flights. His colleagues listened intently, nodding along as he described the patterns he had uncovered. After the presentations, the group brainstormed strategies for addressing systemic issues within the airline industry. Some suggested pushing for stricter regulations around service standards, while others advocated for increased transparency in decision-making processes. Marcus chimed in, emphasizing the importance of accountability. "We need to hold these companies responsible," he said firmly. "They make promises all the time, but we have to ensure they follow through. That means regular audits, unannounced inspections, and consequences for failing to meet expectations." By the end of the day, Marcus felt energized. Being part of a team that shared his passion for fairness reminded him why he loved his job. Together, they were building a network of advocates determined to create change. Even if progress was slow, the collective effort kept hope alive. As he packed up his things and headed home, Marcus thought about the future. Each report, each piece of evidence, brought them closer to a world where everyone, regardless of background or income, could expect equal treatment when traveling. That night, as Marcus sat in his living room reviewing notes for his next assignment, he reflected on the bigger picture. His work wasn't just about exposing injustices, it was about inspiring belief in the possibility of a fairer system. He imagined a day when stories like his wouldn't be necessary anymore, when passengers could board a plane knowing they would be treated with dignity and respect no matter where they sat. Until then, Marcus vowed to keep doing his part, one flight at a time. Marcus's days were a blur of airports, flights, and reports. Each trip added another layer to the growing body of evidence he was building against systemic bias in the airline industry. His work wasn't glamorous. It involved long hours, cramped seats, and countless cups of airport coffee, but it was deeply meaningful. Every observation, every note, and every video clip brought him closer to his goal, creating a world where fairness wasn't optional, but expected. And though progress was slow, Marcus found satisfaction in knowing that each small step forward contributed to something bigger. One evening, as Marcus sat at his desk reviewing footage from his latest flight, his phone buzzed with an alert. It was an email from the Department of Transportation. He opened it quickly, scanning the message for details. The airline he had investigated during his Chicago to Los Angeles trip had taken action, or at least claimed to. According to the update, they had rolled out new training modules for staff, focusing on cultural sensitivity and equitable treatment of passengers. They also introduced a system allowing customers to provide anonymous feedback about their experiences. While these changes weren't revolutionary, they signaled a shift. a sign that pressure from audits like Marcus's could lead to tangible improvements. Marcus leaned back in his chair, letting out a slow breath. He knew better than to celebrate prematurely. New policies didn't always translate into real change, especially when companies were more concerned with optics than outcomes. Still, he felt a flicker of hope. If even one passenger benefited from these adjustments, if someone who might have been ignored or treated unfairly now received the respect they deserved, it would make all his efforts worthwhile. For Marcus, success wasn't measured by headlines or public recognition. It was measured by impact, no matter how small. The next morning, Marcus packed his bag for yet another assignment. This time, he was flying from Dallas to Atlanta under the guise of a freelance photographer named Eric Hayes. His cover story included a portfolio of photos stored on his tablet, along with a few props, a camera strap slung over his shoulder, and a lens cap tucked into his pocket, to sell the role convincingly. As always, he prepared meticulously, ensuring every detail aligned with his identity. To anyone who asked, he was just another traveler chasing creative inspiration across the country. On board the flight, Marcus observed familiar dynamics unfold. First-class passengers were greeted warmly, offered drinks before takeoff, and given personalized attention throughout the journey. In economy, however, the atmosphere was markedly different. Crew members moved briskly through the aisles, dispensing snacks and beverages with minimal interaction. When Marcus pressed his call button to request water, it took nearly 10 minutes for a flight attendant to respond. Meanwhile, a first-class passenger's request for wine was fulfilled almost immediately. Marcus documented the discrepancy carefully, noting both the timing and the tone of the responses. During the flight, Marcus struck up conversations with fellow passengers, subtly steering discussions toward their travel experiences. One woman, seated nearby, a frequent flyer named Linda, shared her frustration about being consistently overlooked for upgrades despite holding elite status with the airline. "It's like they don't see me," she said, shaking her head. "I've flown hundreds of thousands of miles with them, and I still get treated like I'm invisible." Marcus nodded sympathetically, jotting down her comments in his notebook. Stories like hers reinforced what he already knew. Bias wasn't random, it was systemic, woven into the fabric of how airlines operated. As the plane descended into Atlanta, Marcus mentally reviewed everything he had gathered during the flight. He had captured clear examples of unequal treatment, recorded candid interactions between crew members, and collected first-hand accounts from passengers. Once on the ground, he made his way to the nearest quiet corner of the terminal, where he began organizing his notes and transferring footage to the secure server. Every piece of evidence strengthened his case, adding weight to the argument that reform was necessary. Back at his office later that week, Marcus compiled his findings into a comprehensive report. He wrote with precision, ensuring every observation was backed by data and context. The report highlighted patterns of inequality, citing specific incidents from multiple flights to demonstrate the scope of the issue. He also included recommendations for addressing the problems, such as implementing stricter oversight mechanisms, revising employee training programs, and establishing clearer guidelines for handling passenger complaints. Though he couldn't force airlines to act, he hoped his suggestions would guide decision-makers toward meaningful solutions. After submitting the report, Marcus attended another team meeting at the Department of Transportation. The room buzzed with energy as auditors shared updates from their recent assignments. One colleague discussed a breakthrough involving wheelchair accessibility at a major hub, while another highlighted successful negotiations with an airline to improve compensation policies for delayed baggage. When it was Marcus's turn to present, he walked the group through his findings, emphasizing the recurring themes of bias and neglect he had uncovered. His colleagues listened intently, nodding in agreement as he outlined potential strategies for driving change. Following the meeting, Marcus stayed behind to chat with his supervisor. They talked about the challenges of holding airlines accountable, particularly when profit margins often seem to outweigh concerns about fairness. "It's not going to be easy," his supervisor admitted. "But your work is making a difference. You're shining a light on things people don't want to see, and that's powerful." Marcus appreciated the encouragement. He knew the road, Ahead would be long, but hearing that his efforts mattered reminded him why he kept pushing forward. That night, as Marcus sat in his living room reflecting on the day, he thought about the bigger picture. His job wasn't just about catching mistakes or exposing wrongdoing. It was about building a foundation for lasting change. He imagined a future where stories like his wouldn't be necessary anymore. A future where passengers could board a plane knowing they would be treated equally, regardless of race, income, or background. Until then, Marcus vowed to keep doing his part, one flight at a time. For Marcus, fairness wasn't just a concept, it was a mission. He believed deeply in the idea that everyone deserved to be treated with dignity and respect, whether they were traveling for business, pleasure, or survival. And while he understood that true equality might take years, or even decades to achieve, he remained steadfast in his commitment. Quietly, steadily, he chipped away at the barriers that stood in the way, using his skills, his determination, and his unwavering belief in justice to pave the path forward. Because for Marcus Johnson, fairness wasn't a privilege reserved for a select few. It was a guarantee for everyone.